like to also invite you again to our first in-person networking in London on the 21st of March. If you click the link in the pinned comment on the stream, you will be able to get a discounted ticket. You can do this today as one of our viewers. And I am bringing now on Sandra Rothbard from Freight Matters and Simon Rispin. Just a second to click the right buttons. Now, Sandra and Simon, thank you very much both for joining us. We're going to talk about finally for this combination between private and public in warehousing space, but also in logistics. And I wanted to start it with a bit of COVID has changed everything. Do you think it also has changed the way that logistics and the public sector see how they work together? And I'll start with Sandra on this one.
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I certainly think that it has changed, but not necessarily for the better. I think just like everybody became an expert epidemiologist during COVID, all of a sudden everybody became a supply chain expert, right? Everybody's ordering everything online. And, for a while we're clapping and we're thanking the carriers and the delivery drivers for bringing our goods, but then we get really anxious and, well, why isn't my package here? And, I was able to get it so fast before, and suddenly we become so demanding, and our expectations are really high. So we have ordered even more, but I think folks generally are getting more and more antsy if they're not getting what they want right away and not recognizing their impact, right? We complain when the delivery truck is parked in the bike lane, but we don't recognize that our behavior is impacting that. So there's definitely a big disconnect, and it may have grown even greater during COVID.
Simon, how about you? Do you think that Sandra is right on this one?
Yeah, morning everyone again. Nick, thanks for having me. I absolutely agree. I think what COVID did was spike the amount of use that we are all looking to use online e-tail. Immediate delivery, next day delivery, but what it's also done is it's publicised how that process works far more evidently. Everybody now realises that parcels move around the country very quickly, but it is vehicle driven, it is highway driven, and being able to get things next day has an immediate impact on how that works within the network, and therefore the impact it has on everyday life. As Sandra says, we all want the goods immediately, if not sooner, but we don't want the van parked outside.
And for both of you, now we'll bring in a second something that Sandra shared with me as a photo, which is very interesting. But how do you think that, from both of your perspective, warehouses are going to look and are reshaping to look? We'll start with Sandra. While I do this, I bring the photo she shared in just a second on this one. So how are warehousing changing, and the design and what we understand as warehousing is changing?
Sure. So first of all, I'm an urban planner, so I focus on cities and how to make last mile delivery safer and more sustainable. And a lot of that is working with the industry on creative ways to design a micro hub, a micro fulfillment center. And there's no reason why everything has to be a big sprawling mega warehouse or facility. We can design up instead of out, and goods can come, mobily. The back of a truck can be a distribution center. This container can. This is a photo I took in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, where you can order goods, and by cargo bike they can come to this location, and you can pick these goods up. And, there's no reason why we can't be a little more creative. Obviously, if things are coming out in the back of a truck, we want them to be safe. We want them to be parked in the correct location. But there's no telling, what the limit is for what a distribution center or micro hub can be. A lot of companies have tried, some have failed, unfortunately, to put these in former storefronts. Right? If unfortunately many businesses closed during COVID, but what a great way to do some adaptive reuse and actually retrofit some spaces. Obviously, not every single storefront should be a micro fulfillment center. I'm not suggesting that, but there are creative ways to do this, as is seen in this photo.
And Simon, speaking about design, I think I want to bring you here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think fairly innovative in our solutions. We're working with end operators and developers who are testing all of what Sandra talks about there. We've got micro mobility, taking up spaces within car parks which are being underused because people aren't going to the office so much. So we take out a handful of spaces. We put some kind of micro hub in there. We've got schemes which are subterranean, utilising underground space because we can get right in the heart of the city, and we have little or no impact other than the cargo bikes coming and going. But I think it ties into some of what Jonathan was saying just as well about this, and your question about whether we have sufficient land is the designs need to get smarter. We need innovative solutions. Mixed use in terms of retail with residential above is commonplace and accepted. Commercial with residential and retail is commonplace and accepted. I think the next step needs to be smart, clever warehousing fulfillment space mixed in that urban sprawl within that town centre, within, with residential above it, with a retail shop in front of it. All of those can work. It's just about, smarter design. And I think that then spirals into, reducing carbon, decarbonisation, and better buildings. We're looking at things which are more environmental, not only because they're cutting journey times down, because they're closer to the customers, but the buildings themselves are smarter, they're greener, they're more sustainable buildings.
This is to the design and thinking on one side again, assuming private companies are more innovative, more open to new solutions, but then the public sector is probably more focused on following the rules and the status quo. So where does this, who should start the process of this innovation, Sandra?
Well, the government needs to make the rules to allow this to happen. So there's so much to do with land use and zoning, and not just those regulations, but if we want more micro hubs and micro fulfillment or smaller warehouses as close to the consumer as possible, we need to allow developers to build buildings a certain way, but we also need to make sure that transportation options support that. So if we want smaller vehicles and green vehicles and cargo bikes to be able to do and deliver the last mile, and even have residents come to some facilities to pick up items, then we need bike lanes that are wide enough for cargo bikes. We need spaces available for bike parking, or we need truck routes that are going to support the movement of these goods from a highway to a local area and then right back out instead of negatively impacting a community. We need space for truck drivers to park overnight. That is a huge problem, as there is not enough places, safe places for some trucks to park overnight. So it's not just about the building design itself, although that is a huge part of it, but it's also about the land use and zoning rules and regulations, and also the transportation. And sometimes government doesn't recognize that. I worked for New York City government for many, many years. And one of the things that saw constantly was the idea that, well, freight is a private sector thing. We don't need to worry about that. We're government, and that has nothing to do with us. Well, we're worried about people's personal private vehicles. We seem to be talking about that a lot, and where they can park and the curb management regulations there. And guess what? That's not, holding up the economy the way the trucks and cargo bikes or, maritime and rail are. So it's a huge, huge problem. But I did also want to plug that I was part of the creation of a report that came out last year for the American Institute of Architects and the New York chapter, where we actually created a guide called Delivering the Goods. And this was about how can architects design better, and maybe how can we also design some streets better to recognize the need for spaces for vehicles to bring in goods to those facilities, but not just around e-commerce goods, but what about waste, right? Construction logistics. There's all different types of logistics, and it's really critical that we think creatively. And creatively doesn't have to be, some kind of really intense technology. It can be as simple as a warehouse that's 4 stories tall instead of 1 story and really wide. But government needs to be involved.
And Simon, your take on this one?
Yeah, I think there's a few cues there from what Sandra said. I think just picking kind of in reverse, picking up on the creative piece, I think the key point there is, nor does it have to be expensive. There's lots of reasonably easy fixes, making a cycle lane just that little bit wider is not a significant cost, but a significant improvement to a scheme. Having other sector specialists consider last mile, consider freight as part of their scheme, I think is really important as well. A housing developer with 150 houses in a suburban scheme needs to make allowance for a micro-mobility hub as part of that development. So people aren't getting a delivery van outside every house on the street, but they are utilising the container piece, or the same way a high-rise block of flats in the middle of any city has a concierge process. That can be repeated in much more suburban spaces, and what that does is it means that people are collecting goods, therefore there is less traffic because vehicles are doing less drops. And it also means that people can collect when they want. They don't get a delivery into the office the day they've got the tube and don't want to have to take it home. And I think there's some really key but small differences. But I think it absolutely starts, with government, with the process of logistics is now part and parcel of the web of city centres, and it needs to be considered.
I want to pick up on something that Simon just mentioned, which is really important, that a lot of people used to get their deliveries at the office, right? Maybe it was too difficult to do it at home. They were nervous about porch pirates coming and stealing a package, or just, a failed first attempt. There's no porch, no place for a delivery driver to leave something. And so they have to attempt it several times. But many companies and many businesses were actually saying, you know what, this is getting out of control. We actually are not going to let you deliver your personal packages to the office anymore, because then it became a burden for the mailroom at those businesses. And when we talk about how has COVID changed things, this is a really big deal. If people are working remotely now, right? If people are working home, now they're actually available for some of these packages, but that also means they might be ordering online even more because they're not going out for a break during lunch, right? They might be eating lunch at home and they're not shopping in person as much during the day, during the workday. And so it's really shifted a lot. I think it's going to continue to shift, and we're not quite sure where everything will settle, but that's another big change that's happened because of COVID.
And I also wanted to turn a bit into Simon, who is joining us also on the 21st, and you to give us a bit more information on what you're going to talk about and the designing of warehouses and spaces.
Yeah, I think what I'm hoping to cover on the 21st and kind of go a bit more into is the innovative approaches that we are taking, the idea of much more mixed use, including logistics as part and parcel of how it can sit within a cityscape in attractive buildings as architecture, without being, kind of led by a kind of form follows function warehouse that a lot of people will consider when they're not in the market, and they talk about deliveries and last mile. People will think of kind of out of town big warehouses, and I think we can do so much different and so much better. So covering that off, hopefully, Nick.
And one of the things I know, Sandra, you also look into the good examples, and you mentioned what we showed from Amsterdam. What other good examples do you think are there on the market happening right now?
Well, there's a lot of great research that's happening right now. Madrid with City Login has done some micromobility in former or garages, and there's a new Horizon Europe project that's coming out soon called Disco. I helped write the proposal, and I think I'm allowed to say publicly that we've won. We've been awarded the funding, and one of the projects there is we're going to be testing the use of a convention center in Greece to actually store or park trucks overnight. And how do we actually say, oh, you know what? It's not just about retrofitting a space, but can we use a space overnight that might be used for a different use during the day? And how do we make these spaces as efficient as possible? Maybe we don't need an entirely separate facility. So looking at, shared spaces and shared uses throughout the day. And I'm very excited to see what comes of that.
And Simon, also on you, the last thing on the positive, which is happening now on the market.
Yeah, I think just that level of shared space of different buildings being considered for logistics. So as we've touched on, retail space that is sadly kind of had to close over COVID. Those spaces are being used quite cleverly. I think the idea of multiple occupiers using spaces over the 24-hour period, making sure that we can deal with all of the different movements of traffic, a better understanding of that, I think, is coming out. And in government's defence, local authorities' defence, they are starting to understand, I think, a little bit about certainly the shift patterns and the timings of these. The understanding that yes, there is a fleet of vehicles leaving a last mile, and that puts it immediately onto the highway, but that isn't at the same time as the school run. That isn't at the same time as rush hour. It's in nobody's interest that those two things mix. And I think there is better understanding certainly when we kind of approach local authorities with new schemes, that there's more understanding of what these buildings do, how they operate. And I think that's certainly a positive.
Thank you very much, both. And thank to everyone who is watching. As I mentioned, you will be able to see Simon as well as some of the other speakers on the 21st in London. Sandra, Simon, thank you very much. And this is what we have prepared for today. As I mentioned, you are able to get a discounted ticket for our first in-person logistics networking, where Parcelli AutoStore, SMR Architects, Hatat Solutions are going to present. And one of the other presentations will be from a lawyer exploring warehousing contracts. So the event is on the 21st of March in London, Tuesday, and I hope to see you all here. And I will also send you a bit more information from our speaker.